Welcome back. My name is Stephanie Austin, and in this session, we'll go further into detail on the process for designing and implementing a monitoring and evaluation system for climate change adaptation. So GIZ has developed a 5-step model for monitoring and evaluation called Adaptation Made to Measure. In this model, the 5 steps are to describe the adaptation context, to identify the contribution to adaptation, to develop a results framework, to define indicators instead of baseline, and to operationalize the monitoring and evaluation system. So let's go through each of these one at a time. The first step is to describe the adaptation context. So in analyzing the context, you'll want to ask yourself, what do we know about climate risk? So this can include which factors drive climate risk, who or what is most at risk, and how do climate and non-climatic factors interact. You'll also want to look at what you know about climatic parameters. So are there historic records and projections, future projections available for key parameters like temperature and precipitation? And can you get more climate information, or can you get access to climate services to support you in your monitoring and evaluation process? The second step is to identify the contribution to adaptation. So this helps in determining the project focus. It can help illustrate what can be monitored in terms of the adaptation measure, and can also help support identifying indicators in a later step of this process. So when you're looking at identifying the contribution to adaptation, you can do this in terms of looking whether the measure reduces hazards, whether it reduces exposure, or whether it reduces vulnerability. If these two terms are new to you, then I suggest you go back to the sessions related to these concepts in Module 2 of this course. The third step is to develop a results framework. So based on the first 2 steps, what do you think are the anticipated results of the project? To do that, you'll create either what's called a theory of change or a results chain. These are the 2 most common. There you'll map how the change is intended to be achieved, and by doing so you'll really be making your assumptions explicit, and that's really important as part of monitoring and evaluation, to be transparent in your assumptions and your methodology. So let's look at each of the steps of a results chain and the definitions of these steps. First is the activity. So in other words, this is the intervention, or in our case it could be the adaptation measure. Our activity then leads to our output. So the output is what results from an intervention. The output then leads to our outcome, which is the likely or achieved short-term and medium-term effects of an intervention's output, which then in turn leads to an impact. And the impact is the long-term effects produced by development interventions. So these sorts of results chains help us to determine at what points within the results framework adaptation activities and the results of the project should be monitored. It helps us to set up the monitoring and evaluation system. Let's look at this in terms of an example related to our context. So in the context of hydropower infrastructure, let's say that our activity is to be planting trees along the river. This is also known as riparian planting. So once we've done that activity, a plausible output, or in other words, the result from that intervention, could be that the riverbanks may be stabilized and climate-induced erosion is reduced. So once that's happened, then a logical outcome could be that river sediment is reduced. And once river sediment is reduced, a logical impact from that outcome could be a longer lifespan of components like turbines, which otherwise can be heavily impacted by high levels of sediment in the water, and could have reduced costs associated with sediment management due to climate change. So that's a little example of a results chain. The fourth step of the monitoring and evaluation process is to define indicators and set a baseline. So the first part of that is choosing indicators. Now indicators are really important because they essentially define what it is that's being measured. So it's what is being evaluated in terms of your adaptation measure. And how does that indicate success, or what do you want to learn about it? So you'll want to focus your indicators on the crucial spots of the results chain or theory of change. You'll also want to check your indicators against the so-called SMART rule. So is your indicator specific, rather than being too general? Is it measurable rather than being something that you can't measure if it's being achieved or not? Is it attainable rather than something that's being too difficult to achieve? Is it relevant, so relevant to your context and to the adaptation issue? And is it time-bound, so there is an end date by which you plan to achieve this indicator? Together, your indicators need to reflect the contribution to adaptation. Now, it's important to note that indicators don't necessarily provide an explanation of why changes occurred, and that's important to think about too, and we'll talk a little bit about those data sources challenges in a moment. Now, you also want to set a baseline for each indicator. So you record your baseline values for your chosen indicators, and that will have been done partially in step 1 when you're describing your adaptation context. And you'll also want to choose target values that can be achieved by the end of the project. So let's look at a few examples of indicators. The first one here is the percentage of new hydroelectric dams that consider future climate risk. Now I'd like you to pause the video for a moment and consider, do you think this is a smart indicator? Or how do you think this indicator could be rewritten to be smarter? Okay, so let's look at it together. So the indicator is the percentage of new hydroelectric dams that consider future climate risk. Well, it is quite specific. It's not exactly measurable because it's a percentage, so we can measure a percentage, but what percentage are we looking for here? Is it attainable? Yes, it's attainable to have hydroelectric dams that consider future climate risk. Is it relevant? Yes, it's relevant to the context we're discussing. And is it time-bound? No, it doesn't consider a date. So it could be rewritten, for example, to have a certain percentage of new hydroelectric dams that consider future climate risk by, and then a given date. That might help it to be more specific, more measurable, and more time-bound. Another example of an indicator is increased robustness of infrastructure design and long-term investment development by 2030. So I'd like you to pause the video again and think about, is this a smart indicator? And if not, what do you think could be written better? Okay, let's look at it together. So again, the indicator is increased robustness of infrastructure design and long-term investment development by 2030. So is it specific? Yes, it's specific. Is it measurable? Not really. How do you measure if something has increased robustness? We need to rewrite it a little to have more detail. Is it attainable? Yes, it's attainable to have infrastructure design, long-term investment, development more robust. Is it relevant? Yes, it's relevant to our context. And is it time-bound? Yes, because we have that by 2030. So it could be rewritten to just add a few more details. So increased robustness meaning, and then define what's meant by robustness and make it more measurable of infrastructure design and long-term investment development by 2030. And the last step of the monitoring and evaluation process is to operationalize or implement the monitoring and evaluation system. Of course, it's important to design a really strong monitoring and evaluation system, but you have to actually implement it. Now, when operationalizing the monitoring and evaluation system, there are a lot of different aspects to consider here. One is, where does the data come from? So since monitoring can be seen as less urgent than other day-to-day tasks, it's useful to clearly assign monitoring and evaluation responsibilities to relevant staff and to make sure they have enough time for all the associated data entry, management, analysis, and interpretation. Ideally, monitoring and evaluation should be done in a team to benefit from different expertise, and it should also include many of the stakeholders you've been including in the rest of the climate proofing process, such as community members. You could also look at what climate services are already available or whether you need more climate services to be developed. If you think about climate services, you can always go back to Module 3 where we went more in depth on that topic. Another important question and aspect to consider in implementing and operationalizing the monitoring and evaluation system is, how is the data being stored, analyzed, and by whom? So data being the results of your monitoring and evaluating. And here you can either use quantitative or qualitative data. Those are both options. Quantitative data is really useful to assess indicators numerically and can be more straightforward to analyze. But on the other hand, qualitative data can help you to analyze non-numerical information like observations or answers to open-ended questions. And it can also help provide important insights like the underlying reasons or motivations behind any kind of behavior change. If it's possible, it's best to ideally use a mix of quantitative and qualitative information to try to balance the strengths and limitations of each of those. You'll also need to think about the unit of analysis. For example, it could be people, it could be a given site, it could be an infrastructure system, or it could be one specific infrastructure component. And it's important that you think about what that unit of analysis is as you're planning this, because which unit of analysis you choose will change the results of your monitoring and evaluation. While you're operationalizing the monitoring and evaluation system, it's also important to think about knowledge management and how the results of your monitoring and evaluation connect to your project management. Sometimes it can feel like a standalone process that happens after the project is over, but ideally this is something that should be really connected to how the project is carried out and any future steps on the project. You also need to think about the frequency and the timing of the review. Sometimes these are done as a midterm process, sometimes these are done then also at the end of the project, but really it depends on the indicators that you choose in step 4 and on your context. So monitoring and evaluation can be done as frequently as needed for the project and really during any step of the climate proofing process. You'll also need to remember to disseminate the lessons learned and communicate to different audiences so that the results of the monitoring and evaluation and all those lessons learned actually gets shared with a larger group rather than just with whoever did the monitoring and evaluation. Of course, donors will often require that they receive the results of any monitoring and evaluation, and they may even want to be part of designing the monitoring and evaluation system. Communities and any other local stakeholders should certainly receive any results from the monitoring and evaluation and learn from those lessons learned as well. But also, especially with ecosystem-based adaptation, but for any adaptation measures, it's important to communicate back to policymakers and the wider adaptation community. And that's because since ecosystem-based adaptation is something that's relatively newer and people aren't too sure about it, communicating those results back to policymakers and the wider adaptation community will help to spread the message on the effectiveness of ecosystem-based adaptation and to expand the evidence-based for ecosystem-based adaptation. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and I hope you enjoyed that session.